For my thoughts on all the latest happenings in the NFL in a completely relaxed, unscripted format, be sure to check out my channel, JG9 News. And now, on with our feature presentation. If anyone knows Philly sports fans, they know two things about them. Number one, they are some of the most passionate fans in all of sports. They back their team through thick and thin. If you embrace the city, you give it your all, and you deliver and win games, oh man, you're going to be remembered for all time as a legend. But number two, they're also extremely ruthless. If you play like crap, you better believe that they're going to let you know about it. If you disrespect them and the city, they're never going to let you hear the end of it, and they'll be booing you until the end of time. Heck, right now the name Ben Simmons is still a curse word among Philly fans. Some say that when a baby is born, the first words they say are boo. And when you think of Eagles fans booing and just letting someone hear it and pouring it on, obviously, you probably think of the Santa Claus incident from 1968, which I'm not going to dive too much into because it was a massive misconception as to what actually happened on that day. But if you do want to hear more about it, you can do so by clicking the card in the upper right corner. However, I bring up the Santa Claus incident because it seems that when people think of Philadelphia Eagle fans in the 1960s, right or wrong, that's the incident they think of. Roughly 60 years later, that's the one that lives on. But I want to talk about another moment. I want to talk about another incident from the 1960s involving Eagle fans that you have definitely not heard of before, but deserves to be remembered for just how insane it was. You know when a player stinks and you yell out, "Go back to insert city here"? Well, this man that you've been watching is Philadelphia Eagles defensive back Aaron Martin, who I cannot believe there's actually highlights of because he was that bad. And in 1967, that's exactly what happened. Literally, he was booed into exile by the Eagle fans. He was booed so hard and was so bad that after one game, he couldn't take it anymore and literally went home and drove 500 miles and would have driven 500 more just to be the man who drove 1,000 miles to get the heck out of Philadelphia. Because after a 1967 game between the Philadelphia Eagles and the Baltimore Colts, Aaron Martin was booed so badly that he did something that deserves to be remembered nearly 60 years later. And this is the story behind one of the craziest fan moments in Philadelphia Eagles history, and the player that was basically exiled from Philadelphia by his own fans. Before I talk about the actual player in question and what exactly led to his exile, we need some context to understand the importance of the game at hand and how the game itself was going. It's September 24th, 1967. It's week 2 of the NFL season, and we've got a battle on our hands at Franklin Field between the Baltimore Colts and the Philadelphia Eagles. Both the Colts and Eagles enter this game at 1-0, and for the Eagles, as in the main team in our story, this feels like a really big game for them. The reason why? Well, back in 1967, only one team in each division made it to the playoffs. You had to win your division, or else you were sent packing. It was first place or bust. And when you share a division with the Dallas Cowboys, as in one of the best teams in football, and a team that went 10-3-1 and made it to the NFL Championship the year before, you don't exactly have a whole lot of room for error. If the Eagles could win this one on their home field and get to 2-0, they'd keep pace with the Cowboys for first place in the division. Lose this one, and they're already behind the 8 ball. As for how the game went, well, as you can tell by these highlights, or lowlights if you're an Eagles fan, everything about this game for the Eagles was ugly with a capital U. When the final gun went off, it was an absolute embarrassment, as the Baltimore Colts had come into Philadelphia and destroyed the Eagles by a final score of 38-6. Even though Philadelphia had an early 6-0 lead in the first half, following 2 field goals by Sam Baker, the Colts scored the final 38 to put the game completely out of reach, winning it by 32 points and 5 possessions, since back then, in the NFL at least, the 2-point conversion did not exist. Eagles starting quarterback Norm Snead threw no touchdowns and 4 interceptions, getting sacked 5 times, while Colts starting quarterback and future Hall of Famer Johnny Unitas had another great day at the office, throwing for 267 yards, 2 touchdowns, and no interceptions, while posting a passer rating of 105.9. And of the 267 yards that Unitas threw for, and of the 2 touchdowns that Unitas threw, 184 of the yards and both touchdowns went to Willie Anderson, who finished the game with 11 receptions in the process, with the eventual 2-time Pro Bowl wideout putting together the best performance of his career in receptions, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns. Everything about this scheme was complete and utter domination for the Colts, and it would set the scene for them as they eventually went into the final week of the season with an undefeated record. And look, a lot of Eagles played like crap on this day. When you lose a game 38-6, it's not one individual that's solely responsible. You had a starting quarterback that threw 4 interceptions. You had an offensive line that not only allowed said quarterback to get sacked 5 times, but only accrued 58 rushing yards on 3.4 yards per carry. You had an offense that couldn't find the end zone. You had a defensive line that couldn't get to Johnny Unitas at all, never sacking him and allowing 3 rushing touchdowns. So let's make that very clear. There were a lot of Eagles that were absolutely terrible on this day and were completely outmatched and outplayed. However, if there was one Eagle in particular that played the worst of them all, and if there was one Eagle that was the suckiest of all the Eagles who sucked, it was none other than this man right here, Aaron Martin. Don't let the highlights from earlier in the video fool you. This man was terrible. This man was burnt toast on just about every play, and he made up for it by not being able to tackle. In all the footage I watched of Martin, legitimately, I never saw the man make an open field tackle. If there was a receiver one-on-one in the open field with Martin, just expect the receiver to win, because it was as surefire of a bet as the Harlem Globetrotters being the Washington Generals. Martin was part of the highly controversial trade that sent defensive back Irv Cross to the Los Angeles Rams, and you can learn more about Cross by clicking the card in the upper right corner. While he was not the only player of the 1966 trade that the Eagles acquired, as they also got Willie Brown, he was the only one left, as Brown was off the team by 1967. So there was extra scrutiny on Martin when you not only consider how bad he was, but how bad the trade was, as Cross wasn't showing any signs of slowing down with the Rams. It's almost like how Tobias Harris gets a ton of scrutiny today by Philadelphia 76ers fans. It's not just the fact that he stinks and disappears in playoff games, but it's the fact that the front office passed on Jimmy Butler so they could sign Harris. The front office traded away a fan favorite and a great 2-time Pro Bowler in Irv Cross so they could acquire Martin, banking on his potential. And here was a guy who, as you could clearly tell, couldn't cover anyone, couldn't tackle anyone, and couldn't play. He started games in Philadelphia's secondary that season, partly because of sunk cost fallacy, and partly because they really didn't have anyone else. But rest assured, this man was bad, and was arguably the worst starting cornerback in football. But of all the bad games he ever played, as you're about to tell from these lowlights, this Colts game was abysmal. It was a special kind of bad. He was the target of a ton of scrutiny because of just how many catches he allowed and how many tackles he missed. And this isn't one of those things where you can't see the old 22 footage, so you don't know what the assignment on the play was. Almost like how some fans think that a corner got beat when in reality, that wasn't the coverage, and it was actually someone else who blew their assignment. It was crystal clear that Martin was being picked on and was playing terribly. Every jump ball, you knew he was going to lose out. Every ball thrown his way, you knew the receiver was going to win. Every player that came his way, you knew Martin wasn't going to be able to tackle him. He was garbage on this day, and everyone knew it, including himself. And so, the fans began to boo. They booed Martin relentlessly, which makes sense. They paid their hard-earned money to watch their team lose by 32 points and to watch a corner get beat on every play and play like crap. It's what fans do. Heck, I would have done the same thing. And on its own, there's nothing unusual or bizarre about this story. A player plays terribly, and the fans let him know. But this time was different, because Philadelphia boos are a heck of a lot different than regular boos. They're way louder, they're way more vicious, and they resonate a lot more. And Martin, feeling a ton of hate from the fans for his terrible play, decided to do something after the game that no one saw coming. The fans had won. Martin left the team. After the game, Martin left the stadium without talking to reporters. He got in his car and he went home. Except, home wasn't in Philadelphia or anywhere nearby. Home was all the way in North Carolina in the town of New Bern. Home was a solid 500 miles away and a super long, probably 9-hour drive when you factor gas and how the roads were back then. After the loss and after the booze, Martin was so scared of the fans in the city that he just ducked and fled to a state in the South. Said Martin on why he did it, "I knew what was coming. I didn't want to be around to hear it or see it. I never felt lower in my life. It was the worst day I ever had as a football player. I didn't want it to happen, but it did. If the fans could only imagine how I felt." Any fan that yelled, "Go back to where you came from," whether that be referring to Los Angeles where he was before the trade, or his hometown in North Carolina, won. As Martin continued, "It's a terrible feeling. It's tough to express how I felt after the game. I was at the lowest point one can get. I was down in the dumps. I didn't want to read newspapers or talk with sympathetic friends. I went home to North Carolina to get away from it all. It's a hard thing to live with or forget. I keep thinking to myself, suppose I have another game like that. It's a negative point of view, but I can't help it." That same writer that wrote the article, Ralph Bernstein, literally called Martin a bum. The booze got to him. Psychologically, they impacted him. Philadelphia was absolutely ruthless to this man. He even knew that the next time he showed his face in Philly, whenever the heck that was, because he didn't know, that he was going to be booed to death, saying that he was a victim of circumstances and was going to get a warm greeting. But just like that, Martin was gone. The fans had won for the moment. Martin was booed so hard that he left the team and went into a self-imposed exile because he couldn't take it anymore. It got so bad that the Eagles coaching staff had to bring him back and beg him to ignore the fans and come back to Philadelphia and just try and tune out the noise the best way that he could, with their head coach saying, "Sometimes players think they're out in the Coliseum and the Lions are waiting. You just have to ignore fans." That's what I told Martin. I told it to him during the week. Whatever was said and how it was delivered clearly worked, but at least for a brief moment in time, the fans led him to literally leave the city, and in the words of Scar, run away and never come back. As for what happened to the man who never really caught on with this team behind me right here in the Philadelphia Eagles, when he returned to Philadelphia, he was booed a ton and was still playing garbage football. Granted, he never played as bad as he did against the Colts, although it's tough to play as bad as he did against the Colts. We lined up on Willie Richardson, and he does, well, everything we just saw him do. Amazingly enough, Martin started every single game in the secondary for Philadelphia that season, starting 14 out of the possible 14 games. Having said that, the Eagles had the third worst passing defense in terms of yards allowed, and the second worst passing defense in terms of touchdowns allowed, and Martin definitely had something to do with that, as the Eagles disappointingly finished that season below 500. Martin did not play for the Eagles after the 1967 season, and would spend one more year in Washington in 1968 before flaming out of the NFL for good. For Eagle fans who were around in the 1960s, the name Aaron Martin is almost like Freddie Mitchell, or J.J. Arcega-Whiteside, or Nelson Aguilar today. You don't say it. It brings back horrible memories, and they were all terrible, terrible players in Philadelphia who were public enemy number one by the fans at the time. Martin eventually said when he returned to Philadelphia after his hiatus in North Carolina, "Some writers told me when I came here that I was bearing a heavy cross," referring to Irv Cross, the man that they traded. "I think I'm really bearing it." And man, was that true for this man right here during that game against the Colts, when he was so bad and felt the brunt of so much criticism from the fans, and rightfully so for his poor play, that he had to leave the team and leave the city and get away from it all just because he couldn't take it anymore and couldn't be around the fans. He was psychologically screwed up by Eagles fans. Because if you want another story about the passion or the intensity of Eagle fans, or whatever the heck you want to call it, this one has been forgotten about nearly 6 decades later. but deserves to be remembered for how insane it was, seeing as a player literally drove 500 miles away to go home and escape Philadelphia because the fan support was that brutal and that ugly. Because after week 2 of the 1967 season, Aaron Martin went away to go to the North Carolina town of New Bern. Or I guess, if you're a Simpsons fan based on how this story went, the town of New Bern. Get your official Jaguar Gear 9 merchandise by going to jj9shop.com, and be sure to like and subscribe, as it really helps the channel out a lot. Join me every Wednesday night where we'll play NFL Trivia for cash prizes at 9 p.m. Eastern over on Twitch. To learn more about the history of college football, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 8. To learn more about the history of Major League Baseball, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 7. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.